Thank you for watching. My name is Glenn Morgan, and this is We the Govern. Today we're going to be talking about how you can be more effective as an activist and pay attention to what's happening in your state legislature. All right, we are back in Washington State, and it is January 2021. The legislative session has begun just a few days ago, and I think it's important as people who are concerned and activists, they want to pay attention to what's happening in Olympia, that we discuss how to track what's happening and how to properly engage, or at least most effectively engage, the legislature in Olympia. And ultimately, when you're paying attention to anything government does, this still comes down to a proven rule and a truism that exists, I think, for now throughout the future, and that is follow the money. When it comes to government, they kick a lot of cash out. Follow the money. It really does matter if you're an activist and if you're concerned about what's happening in government. Now, there are going to be several predictable games and scams that at least I'm going to call them scams, that they kind of play in government to make this process a little bit harder. But it's important that as an activist or somebody who's concerned about government, or a journalist, citizen journalist, if you want to pay attention, follow the money. And there is a lot of it. There's a lot of money that gets kicked out of government. Washington State's budget is going to it's in the billions, and it's going to be around $60 billion, maybe a little bit less this year, we'll see. And that's just for the general fund, and then there's other budgets that get piled on top of it. And there's a lot of money that gets shoveled out to special interests. And that really is one of the things you should pay attention to, is who gets the money. They are shoveling billions of dollars out the door. Ultimately, it's your money, and we should know where it goes and why and how did it get there. So the one thing to remember is, since the legislature's in session, it's important to get an idea of who's actually in charge of signing these bills or making the legislation happen. The last step in that process is Governor Inslee, who believes he is starting his third term, believes it's good to be king. He may have the title of governor, and he does sign on these bills, but he has a tremendous amount of influence as to which bills land on his desk as well. But he's an important part of the process, and even though he's in the executive branch of government, it's still important to know and pay attention to what he is signaling and what he wants to do. Then you have the state Senate, one of the two branches of the legislative side of government. There are 49 state senators. They are elected on 4-year terms. Half of them are up every other year. Or half of them are up, I should say, on every other even year. And they are one of them for each of the legislative districts. We have 49 leg districts in Washington State, so there's 49 state senators. There's also the state legislature. And there's a lot more of them. So in the state legislature, you have 98 legislators, 2 for each district. They are all elected every 2 years. And these are the 3 little groups of people, Inslee being one of them, representing the executive side of the government. He has to sign off on all the bills, and the other 2 the other 2 branches have to approve the bills. And so these guys in Olympia, normally when they're in Olympia, right now they're in a Zoom legislative session, so who knows where they're actually calling in to debate and sign off on all these bills. They have to agree on whatever legislation is going to land on Governor Inslee's desk. And so this is kind of one of those checks and balances that was built by the founders of Washington State into our state constitution, into the form of government that we have today, so that these 2 bodies of elected officials have to negotiate or come to some kind of a negotiation as to what the final form of that legislation will be when it gets sent up to Governor Inslee. And then Inslee, in theory, represents that kind of last check on what type of legislation actually becomes law. And that's really what matters. If he approves it, which he usually does, then shortly after his signature, it's usually about 90 days, it becomes a law officially. And so that's the process that you have to pay attention to in Olympia. But of course, these aren't the only players. There are other players involved in the process too. Lobbyists and special interests are always in Olympia. They're legally obligated. They're legally obligated to actually register with the state as professional lobbyists. They represent a variety of special interests, and they are there kind of flooding the halls of power normally. During this Zoom session, we don't know where they are exactly, but somehow they're reaching out presumably to the elected officials, telling them what their constituents or the people that are paying them big bucks to represent them, what they actually want. The other group of people oftentimes ignored by the public and people observing government is the bureaucracy. They occasionally come out of the swampy back reaches of Olympia to influence legislation, and they do this all the time, usually more in the background. And it's an important part, probably the biggest constituency in Olympia is the bureaucracy itself, and there are various little subdivisions of that bureaucracy, making sure that they get the piece of the pie that they want and making sure that they're involved. Finally, last but not least, the grassroots, we the people, those who are willing to show up. They aren't paid to do so. They're oftentimes having to take time off work, drive halfway across the state for a 3-minute public comment or a rally outside the state capitol when the National Guard actually will allow you to do so, or to lobby their legislator, or to lobby other legislators that may be involved in certain pieces of legislation that really matter to the people who get motivated to come down to Olympia. And it's kind of worth talking about this in a little bit more detail of who these special groups are and what their role is. Lobbyists and for special interests, to some extent, they get a bad rap that's not always deserved, but they do push for special treatment for the people they represent. Oftentimes, this means, when it comes to special treatment, either regulatory restrictions on their competitors or oftentimes cash in some way, some kind of discount, some kind of way to have government kick money over to them. If they're lobbyists for nonprofits, it's to represent groups that actually want in on the grant grifting schemes that proliferate local government and especially state government in Washington state. They want to get that money for their clients. They only get paid to do that, and that's one of the big things that they do. It's not all they do, though, and this is what people sometimes forget about lobbyists, is that oftentimes there are special interests in the state that didn't want to have anything to do with lobbying government at all until government decided to get involved in maybe taking away some of their ability to run a business, or taking away their freedoms, or harassing them in some other way. And so hiring a lobbyist is more defensive because they're trying to protect their members, the people who have hired them, from governmental abuse of authority. This is inevitable. The bigger government gets, the more it kind of just expands like the blob, and it absorbs all these other people, and it affects people's lives a lot more. And so that's a big part of what lobbyists do, is not just push for special treatment, which usually annoys a lot of people, but also to protect their members from abuse. The other part that people don't oftentimes appreciate that lobbyists play is identifying who the friends and enemies are in the political process for these special interests. And in doing so, they're helping ultimately to direct campaign cash in future elections to go to the people who support your cause, or the people you're representing, or the people who oppose them, just so you know. Maybe that they'll decide that particular legislator is doing a terrible job and harming the people that this lobbyist represents. And so those people will realize, listen, we can't reach out to them. We got to actually try to get somebody else in office. So it's kind of a little, it's not a part that people really notice for lobbyists, but it is an important part of what they do, even at the state level. The other special interest that is involved, as I mentioned earlier, is the bureaucracy. And really the interesting thing about the bureaucracy is that they really play for the long game. They view themselves as eternal. Many of these bureaucrats have been in office. The senior bureaucrats have been in office for decades, a lot longer than Governor Inslee has been there, and certainly longer than any of the legislators, the senators, or any of the politicians. And they always view themselves as able to outlast the politicians. And the politicians are here temporarily, and the bureaucrats are here forever. And usually the universal thing that they're always pushing for is more money and more power. Bureaucracy, the nature of bureaucracy is to grow. That's just what they do. And so they're always in there lobbying and pushing for little, sometimes just incremental changes, but little changes that increases the number of people that they have in their bureaucracy, increases their budget, increases the power. That's one of the ways they can increase their budget. If they increase their power, then scope, they get to hire more people, et cetera, and that's how it goes. The other thing that bureaucracy is inevitably involved in almost all the time now is to try to reduce transparency and oversight. They always want less transparency. They want more money, more power. They want less transparency. These are very predictable things, and you'll always see the bureaucracy when they go up and testify, whatever bureaucrat happens to be representing whatever agency. Inevitably, it's always angled in this direction. Reduce the transparency and oversight of their agency to get more money and more power. And then, of course, finally, it's the people. And the people, grassroots of whatever political stripe they might represent, they're scary. people are scary because they're unpredictable. And they are easily distracted. The view of the politicians and the bureaucrats is that people can get easily riled up, and they're always nervous about that. And so they try to find ways of distracting them. Legislators, Governor Inslee, these bureaucrats, special interests will try to distract people because generally political insiders want them to stay away. They want you to stay away from Olympia, stay away from these legislators, let the professionals handle it. They don't want the people involved most of the time. Now, they'll occasionally make exceptions for this when they believe that getting a big group of people in Olympia will really help their cause. Those are usually just narrow events and situations. But most of the time, they'd really just rather you stay away. Please leave them alone. Let the professionals handle the politicians in Olympia. And the reason for that is that they don't want scenes like this, which a couple years ago, the hairdressers came out in Olympia in force when the predictable nature of government, the politicians had actually proposed, the Democrats had proposed a bill that was going to destroy the ability of hairstylists to be able to operate independently in Washington state. So 1,500 hairstylists showed up in Olympia, and they showed up at all the hearings. They showed up outside in the Capitol steps. They had protests. They went to every single elected official's office in Olympia. And it was shocking and surprising, I think, to some of the political insiders. They didn't expect this kind of pushback. And by doing so, they were able to eliminate that law from the books at the time. And that would not have happened had they not shown up and made an impact. So the basics to remember when you're looking at the budget and trying to understand, especially if you haven't been around the political process, Washington state essentially has a 2-year budget. It's when they set the budget, it's really for 2 years at a time. So it's not annual, it's a 2-year budget to remember. That's important to remember. So when you see it's a $60 billion budget, that's about $30 billion each year. Then there's the odd year is called the long session. This is set in the state constitution, but that means it's about 105 days long. And the odd year is always going to be after a legislative cycle. So even years, because the legislators are elected every 2 years, state senators every 4, the governor once every 4 years, and the state senators are elected, half of them every 4 years. So they kind of go on a rotating cycle. Long session is 105 days. It's a part-time legislature, but that's what they call the long session. And the short session, 60 days. And those are going to be on the election cycle years. That's the easiest way to remember it, is if you know there's an election coming up on an even number year, then that's going to be, in theory, a shorter session. And the governor can call special sessions and bring them back for 30 days at a time if he chooses to do so. But for the most part, the legislature is going to operate within these two windows, the long session, which is what we're in this year, and a short session, which is what we'll see next year. And it's just important to kind of keep that in mind. There is only one primary job the legislature has during the long session, just one. The Constitution requires it, and it's the one thing they do, and it's the one thing they postpone to the last minute, and that is pass a budget. It's the one thing they have to do. That's it. I mean, literally, they could go to Olympia, not have a single other bill proposed, get a budget out the door, and they will have done their constitutional job. And yet, that's the thing that you hear about the least until the very last minute. And that's just the way things go, because budgets are boring. And let's face it, there's not a lot of excitement there. And frankly, the political insiders sure as heck don't want you to see or even have any idea about the negotiations that are going on behind the scenes for the billions of dollars and your tax dollars and how they're going to squander them this next cycle. So bring in the clowns. Let's distract people. There's a lot of distraction in Olympia. You have the legislators' distraction. You have the bureaucracy throwing up distractions that tend to come along. Special interests trying to throw up their distractions. And of course, our good Governor Inslee, who has his own share of distractions and is enjoying the fact that he's going for his third term right now. This creates a lot of things to get distracted about. Well, the budget's actually going on behind the scenes, or at least we presume it's going on. It's the one thing they have to do, but they do want to distract you. And part of this distraction is also just posturing, because when they're proposing the bills in Olympia, remember, they want to reward their friends. It's one of the advantages. Elections have consequences. People helped get these politicians in office. They do want to reward their friends. They also want to punish their enemies. There were people who oppose them, and they want to make sure that those people suffer in whatever way they can with the bills and the legislation that they propose and get through. And they also want to fire up their base. particularly on election years, that really does matter. But firing up their base, and kind of on the opposite side of that, they don't want to fire up the other guy's base. And so these are kind of some of the behind-the-scenes dynamics that apply to almost every piece of legislation you'll see proposed. There'll be some boring bills that you may not pay much attention to that don't fit into one of these categories, but generally these three categories, almost all bills you can see kind of fit into this category. So that's why you'll see the legislature over the last decades, they'll spend the first couple months just arguing about some kind of relatively obscure social policy fight that may not even come to the floor for a vote, but they'll spend an inordinate amount of time distracting people arguing on that issue, while meanwhile behind the scenes the budget negotiations are actually going on. So this budget is negotiated in secret. We really don't know what's happening with that budget. And that's particularly true when you have a scenario like we do right now, where in Washington state the Democratic Party controls the governor's mansion as well as both state houses. Now, this wasn't true recently. Not that long ago, the Republicans had nominal control of the state Senate. And so because of that, they were able to actually have a lot more influence on this process, and they were on the inside. But right now, the Republicans are largely frozen out of this process. And there's really no reason to bring them into it, because the budget, with the exception of the capital budget, some of the bonding there, it only needs, they really only need to be brought in at the last minute for a vote on the floor, and the Democrats will usually line up those votes in advance. So until that budget is revealed in the last minute, it's just about creating more drama and other distractions until that budget's actually complete. So that's just the way it works. Now, it's not that it's a total secret as to maybe what's going on. The governor oftentimes will propose a budget, as Inslee has done, and as many governors have in the past. Well, they'll propose a budget that they send over to the legislature, but it doesn't have any kind of force of law. It may be a nice reference document to use. Oftentimes, the governor will also be posturing for his special interests, and he'll throw all kinds of different things in there. And then it really is, though, the legislature's job, Senate and the House, to sit down and figure out, well, do we want more money there? Do we want a totally different line item? Do we want to shrink what the governor did? Whatever the debates, the real battle that's going on right now behind the scenes of the budget. But the governor does say, hey, here's a budget proposal, and he'll send it over. Now, there's essentially three budgets, and this is kind of worth remembering. It's not actually, I don't think it's super important, but in the lingo of budget debates in Olympia, it's important to know there are three. There's the general fund budget, which is the one that most people spend their time focused on, because that covers all of education. It covers a number of different typical activities that we relate to the day-to-day operations of government. And then there's the transportation budget, which is really segmented because there's a lot of federal funds that come into it, and there's federal law and rule why it's segmented this way. That is, in theory, supposed to be dedicated to things like roads or squandered on train projects or other things like that. So there's a separate budget that is very large as well that's debated in that category that most people don't pay much attention to. And then there's the capital budget, which is the smallest of the three. And this is the budget that the Republicans actually get a little bit of power and they get to have some influence over it, because the capital budget is mainly for buildings and infrastructure. And the part of that's that they're allowed to use the capital budgets where they actually get bonding. And based on the state constitution and issues that had come up in the past, the belief was that if you could put your future generations in debt with decisions you make today by bonding, that those decisions needed to have a larger percentage of the vote, and therefore you need 60% of the vote. And the Republicans have a high enough percentage in the House and the state Senate to have some influence over that. They can actually block bonds from coming out. They could block the capital budget. So because of that, that's the one leverage piece that the Republicans have at this cycle. And so that budget will have maybe a little bit more back and forth and negotiations in advance. But there's essentially these three budgets. The general fund is where the arguments and the fights usually are, and that's where a lot of pork gets kind of shoved into that budget, and that's where we're at. That's how you look at the budget. Meanwhile, they want you to pay attention to the circus and the drama of all these other bills that have nothing to do with any of those budgets, and that's what you see typically going on. And it's easy to do that because you have almost 3,000 proposed bills that'll come through each legislative cycle. We don't have that many proposed yet. I would expect this year to be a little bit less than normal, but that's typical for a legislative session. Maybe only 500 of them will get to the floor for a vote. Again, I don't know how the Zoom legislative session will be different and how that'll affect how many bills actually get to the floor for a vote. And of course, they really aren't even getting to the floor. They're just going to be getting to some kind of an electronic remote computer program where the legislators will be voting on them. But regardless, it's a much smaller percentage than the number of bills that are proposed. And, honestly, 90% of these bills are probably not going to have any impact on you because a good percentage of the bills that do get to the floor are oftentimes the ones that are the least contentious. They're minor tweaks to esoteric laws. Sometimes they're modernizing different pieces of legislation. Sometimes they sneak stuff into those types of bills. But a lot of times there's a good percentage of these bills that reality is, unless you're in a very narrow category and you're directly influenced by something that bill covers, a lot of these bills aren't going to affect you. It's really this other much smaller percentage of bills that are really worth spending your time on. But again, it's easy to get distracted by a whole bunch of things that don't really matter because the circus is in town, the legislature's in session, and if there's one thing politicians are good at, it's trying to draw attention to themselves and their causes. So I think it's always best to focus on the bills that actually matter. And if you care about freedom and liberty, you should focus on the bills that are actually direct attacks on your freedom. And let's face it, this is a Democrat-controlled legislative session, and if there's one thing that, unfortunately, people who are on the more collectivist mindset of government, they do like to attack your freedoms. And so I would pay attention to those bills. There's not going to be a huge number of them, but there'll be a bunch. Those are the ones you want to pay attention to. You also want to pay attention to the bills that are going to be attacks on your finances. It's not just taxes, but it could be fees or it could be regulatory impacts on the cost of just living in the state. The carbon tax that we've discussed before, that's going to increase the cost of fuel. So anything that's going to have a direct impact on your freedoms and your finances, really those are quite worth paying attention to and being engaged and involved in. And finally, and this is the one that gets ignored a little bit, which is attacks on transparency. It is important, I think, as activists to resist and push back on transparency attacks, things that make government more and more opaque, harder to figure out what's going on, because I believe that the more hidden and concealed government and bureaucracy becomes, the more likely they are to be prone to corruption or nefarious activities when nobody's really watching. So those are the areas I'd focus on. The circus, which is the legislature, the issues in Olympia, they really do fear the people. I think it's important to remember that. They fear having a bunch of people come down to Olympia, like the hairdressers. That's why you get a bunch of people in Olympia who say they don't like firearms and they don't believe that walls work, suddenly surround themselves with 10-foot high chain link fences and many armed National Guardsmen. They really would prefer to keep you out. Any excuse and any possible excuse you can have to keep you out is going to be their highest priority. And I will point out that there was a pretty stark contrast with several votes early on in the legislative session where the Republicans clearly identified with being more open for the people to come on campus, and the Democrats clearly wanted to keep the people off campus. And so keep them away from the Capitol, keep them away from the legislators, keep them out of the people's business, which is what the legislature is supposedly calls what they do. So I think it's important to realize there has been a difference party-wise. There isn't always, but there has been recently, and I think that's important to just pay attention to. So again, focus on the bills that matter. If you care about freedom and liberty, focus on the bills that attack your freedoms, focus on the bills that attack your finances, focus on the bills that are going to reduce government transparency. These should always be, I think, our priorities. And also, when you look at the budget, which is the only thing the legislature has to do this cycle, watch who gets rewarded, who gets the money, who gets the grant grifting schemes, who gets the contracts, who gets the cash. That's important. And also, who pays the price? This is kind of that reward your friends and punish your enemies thing. Always pay attention to this. It's going to signal a lot because it's going to tell you that who has the power and who's got the most influence in Olympia. That's helpful to know. It's important to know, and it would probably affect how you approach activism if you care about freedom and liberty or you want to make changes moving forward. You just want to face the reality of how things are operating right now. So don't be distracted by the circus as much as they might want to turn the legislature into a circus with whatever shiny object on the hill that's going to distract you away from these other bills that actually do matter. Don't be distracted by that. Don't be distracted by goofy statements and incoherent statements that the governor might make. That is not the high priority right now, and it really doesn't matter. His lockdowns matter. Changing that does matter. We want to improve freedom in the state, but don't be too distracted by that. The bureaucracy will probably try to operate deep in the swamp and try to stay off your radar as much as possible, but don't be too distracted or concerned about the inevitable bloat and growth that occurs there. And just remember, ultimately, the future does belong to those who show up. Those who actually show up and impact, we have the ability to make a difference if we stay focused on impacting the pieces of legislation and the legislators who will listen to us on the bills that matter. We don't have to be intimidated by the fact that the Capitol right now is surrounded by National Guardsmen and 10-foot-high chain link fences to keep you and I out and to keep our legislators out and to keep us from having any access or transparency on what's actually happening behind these walls and behind these armed individuals here. We should not be intimidated by it. They are fearful of us paying attention to them. And just like those hairdressers a couple years ago, just like people who have showed up and made an impact in the past, the future really does belong to those who show up. You have the ability to make a difference, no matter what you might feel like right now, because perhaps your candidate or your policy didn't seem to go through. You have the difference, we have the power, and we have the ability to make a difference. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and share. Also go to my website, wethegovern.com, where you can learn more and subscribe to the website. I have been censored on social media platforms lately, and I don't know how much more that some of those platforms will allow me to share information like this with you. And remember, for those who care about activism, good government, and transparency, the future will belong to those who show up.